Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers, presented by FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. And here I am, about to ask what is apparently an unanswerable question, at least where you stand. What's new and exciting in your world this week, Ant?
One of the contributors to our Words and Numbers Backstage group on Facebook recently shared an article from the New York Times asking the question, do you live in a political bubble?
Short answer for everyone, yes.
Yeah, pretty much it is yes. Researchers compared voters to their neighbors in an attempt to measure political isolation. That is, how many of us live in areas where we are surrounded by a lot of other people who vote the same way we do. Unfortunately, the survey only looks at voting, so independents and libertarians aren't excluded, but they are misclassified. If you consider yourself independent but voted Democrat in the last election, then the researchers classify you as Democrat. The trade-off to losing precision is massive amounts of data. The researchers looked at voting precinct level numbers. And again, precision aside, they find something interesting. As you might imagine, Americans today tend to live in bubbles. We surround ourselves with people who agree with us. Of course, this plays out on Facebook and Twitter, but it also plays out in where we choose to live. Almost 40% of Democrats live in areas in which fewer than a quarter of their neighbors are Republicans. And that's twice the isolation of Republicans, 20% of whom live in areas where fewer than a quarter of their neighbors are Democrats. The most isolated Democratic enclave is San Francisco and Oakland, California, where almost 100% of the population votes Democrat. The most isolated Republican enclave is Gillette, Wyoming, where almost 100% of the population votes Republican. If you look at a map of the U.S., you see the same isolation effect. But while we talk about it as Democrat and Republican, I wonder if it's something else, because the Democratic bubbles are all located in high-density urban areas, while the Republican bubbles are located in the low-density rural areas. As people's lives, concerns, and priorities necessarily are different in urban versus rural environments, I can't help but wonder if our apparent inability to understand each other isn't political at all, but rather a matter of how we live our lives so differently.
Well, it's always been the case that there's an urban-rural divide in American politics. This goes all the way back to the Washington administration. In fact, it goes back prior to that. This was one of those things that the framers were wringing their hands over as they tried to figure out how to govern this place. There's another thing here, though, and I think it deserves more attention than you gave it. You were willing to accept the lack of precision. I don't think I am, for the following reason. Independents are the largest group in the United States. They're bigger than Republicans. They're bigger than Democrats.
Yeah.
So when you start taking liberties with what you think that group really means or says, that's too many people. It's not like a 10% minority where it gets smoothed out by all the other data. It's like a 40% plurality, and it doesn't get smoothed out in the other data, right? This is enough. I think they should have taken those people out entirely. If they're not declaring their intentions, you will never know their intentions. And you can make some guesses, but that's all it is. It's a guess.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you here. I mean, they took the simplistic approach of looking at how you voted and say, look, if you voted Democrat, we're going to classify as Democrat. And that creates all sorts of problems, not just for independents, but for libertarians. There are a lot of libertarians who, if forced to choose between a Democrat and a Republican, some of them are going to go one way, some are going to go the other.
I mean, look at it this way, though, Ant. In 1976, the country was wildly Democratic.
Yeah.
By 1980, it was unbelievably Republican.
Yeah.
That's nonsense, right? It's the same country. So careful with the conclusions you draw here. I really think that this is more difficult than most people would accept. You know, if you really want to see what's going on, look at that red and blue map that concentrates on counties instead of some other division like states, right? And you can see across the country that every single rural area is Republican. The vast majority of the land space in the country is Republican. The vast majority of the urban areas are Democratic, right?
Yep.
And so I think that really is the right way to go when you're trying to figure this stuff out. Of course, nothing has really changed if you look at things that way for quite some time. So people are on the lookout for some kind of novelty.
This all, to me, goes back to this principle of subsidiarity. If indeed we do break along those lines of rural versus urban, that's all the more reason why we should be governing at the local level, not at the federal level.
Interesting that you would bring up subsidiarity. Of course, you can't help it, what with being so Catholic and all. So I've got something to talk about with you that just drills right into those things, Ant, because apparently Catholic schools across the country are losing students at a record rate, and many are closing. My own high school, Sacred Heart High School in Waterbury, Connecticut, this will be its last year. People there tried to take donations and the whatnot to get the school open for another few years, and they were able to raise a significant amount. But the diocese said, no, sorry, not going to happen. And I think, you could see them drawing a very hard line, even in the face of a possibility of remaining open, because sooner or later, somebody's got to look at the bottom line, and it's going to be from the diocese office. But I do find it interesting that Catholic schools are feeling the pinch right now.
Well, this has been going on for a while, and one of the main drivers is the lack of religious. And it happened over just one generation. When I started in Catholic school in first grade, almost all the teachers were sisters, were religious. By the time I graduated high school, it was half and half. By the time my kids became of age, none. Nowhere did you find a religious.
This is an interesting observation, right? Because I went to French Canada to stay there for a while, probably 20 years ago, and I looked around, and it was very fascinating what I saw there. French Canadians are overwhelmingly Catholic, and yet as I drove around, what I found is that the Catholic Church in every other town was shuttered. The people just lost interest. And I thought, okay, this is a concentrated version, right? These are all Catholics living in the same place. So when you get back to the States, it's never overwhelmingly Catholic. It's at best a mix from Protestant to Catholic. But if this business was happening in French Canada, where they're staunchly Catholic, they walked away in the space of one generation.
Yep.
Not only were the churches shuttered, the institution of marriage seemed to have gone out of style. Every person in their 20s I met was living with a boyfriend or girlfriend and raising a child, but then they didn't stay together over those next 25 years. There seemed to be some kind of rotation out of that. And it was curious, right? And what I saw there, I became pretty convinced I was going to see down here.
And I think things are getting worse coming out of COVID. Here in Pennsylvania, the churches were shut down, and there was no hue and cry from the Catholic bishops. And so what they were doing was just announcing to the world that they consider the church non-essential. If they do, why is anybody else bothering?
That's exactly so. I doubt we're going to see anything but this trend continuing. It'll be interesting to watch. And after a while, it's going to spill over into other mainstream religions, I suspect. Organized religion has its fingers in many of the institutions of civil society, right? So as one goes, there is danger on the other side of that equation, and we'll have to keep an eye on what really happens there. For the foolishness of the weekend, and I got to say, this was not the easiest week to pull something idiotic out of. There were some people who said moderately stupid things, but when is that not true? But I did see one thing. It was published in the Washington Post, and we'll leave a link for you in the show notes. But a guy named Dan Balls, about a day ago, here's the headline: "A blinking light ahead. Slowing population growth raises questions about America as a land with unlimited horizons." Well, what does one thing have to do with the other? And I would submit it's exactly nothing. If you're looking at slowing population growth across the country, probably a good thing. It's probably indicative of a set of reasons that now are coming to bear. And I can't help but think when I see declining birth rates, what I see is that people are holding off on having families. They're probably in their 30s now. When my grandmother's generation, they were all 19. Isn't that somehow better? Well, yeah, of course it is. And why does that happen? Because we all live longer now. My grandmother at age 19 might well have been middle-aged. We're all looking at about 80 years of living time now, and it goes up very, very sequentially. Year in, year out, it keeps going up. So I expect people to hold off on having families. And dare I say it, living a little before they get married, going places, trying out some jobs. And I think that's a great thing. But what I see most clearly is that people aren't having gigantic families to help run the farm.
Right.
This is where children always inflated the stats, right? Given that the mortality rate on children was roughly 40%, you had to have quite a few of them to make sure somebody be out there driving the tractor. Yep. I don't want to live that way. In fact, I think it's perfectly obvious that no one wants to live that way. People had to once upon a time, they no longer want to because they don't have to. And when I see this kind of caterwauling about a declining population increase rate, all I see is good news. I see a bunch of people who have lots of better options. I just don't understand what this incessant whining over birth rates is, especially when it's the same exact people who tell us that we're overpopulated and there won't be enough food. I know you ask incoming freshmen a suite of questions just to get used to what they believe. Ask them what they think the biggest threat facing the country is. They always say overpopulation. It's always one of the top two. It's environment nonsense, which they can't prove and have no evidence for, and it's overpopulation nonsense, which they can't prove and have no evidence for.
To pick up your copy of our book, Cooperation and Coercion, look us up on Amazon, and if you've already read our book, try your hand at writing and leave us a review.
That'd be great.
Vann Prime joins us this week. Vann is the Advanced Placement, or AP, teacher at Mount Hebron High School in Ellicott City, Maryland. He teaches AP Economics, AP European History, and AP Art History. He founded Mount Hebron's economics program, which is one of the most successful high school economics programs in the country. Prior to his time in the classroom, Vann was a clandestine services intelligence officer at the CIA and an international trade advisor at a law firm in Washington, D.C.
I can add that I think Vann is one of the all-time great human beings.
He is. Vann, welcome to Words and Numbers.
Thanks so much, gents.
Vann, I just have to say before we even start that you have to have the coolest name of any guest we've ever had. Vann Prime. It sounds like a superhero.
It ties with one of our fans, Coots Mosley.
Coots, yeah, that's right.
On Words and Numbers, we have talked a number of times about problems in the public education system, and here's an opportunity to talk with you who come from a, in your own words, run-of-the-mill, straight-up public school. It's not a magnet school. It's not a charter school in Maryland, middle-income area. And yet, what you have achieved there is astounding. You founded the AP Economics program at your high school, and your students compete nationally in economics challenges. They have won the national championship 4 times. They've been national finalists 7 times. Maryland state champions 14 times, and they're the most successful team in the Council on Economic Education's history. And on top of that, this is an AP Economics course. 96% of your students pass the AP Economics exam, 60% of them with perfect scores.
Good Lord.
This is astounding.
And let me just add to this to embarrass Vann just a little more before we actually let him speak. You and I have lectured at his school a couple of times now. And Vann, I can tell you that when I'm up on the stage talking to your students, it's as if I'm in a 200-level college classroom of overachievers.
Yeah, of overachievers. Exactly.
Your high school students eclipse probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the college students I see as freshmen and sophomores.
And so here you are on Words and Numbers to set the record straight on public education, that it is not the horrible thing that we make it out to be. There are gems out there, and here's one of them.
Actually, I'd push back against that. I think public education is the horrible thing that you think it is. I think this is an anomaly. But that's also unfair because I have really outstanding colleagues and peers who do their best. You've heard this a million times from educators. It's not the teachers. I think the teachers on the whole do their absolute best, but the whole thing is the structure above them. We work in an extraordinarily top-down system. People say, well, communism hasn't been tried. Well, it's tried over and over and over again in the public schools. And it's becoming more regulated, more top-down, more centralized, more standardized. And it's funny that in public school systems that largely are lauding the concept of diversity, they ask from their teachers standardization. It's such a bizarre thing. But back to economics and econ challenge at Hebron, I am a proselyte of Words and Numbers. I cannot thank you and James and Fee enough for your generosity and the time that you have given our young people. You speak to at our school 135 econ students. You've done so for the past several years. This is at no cost to the school. When I was a high school student, we had no contact with college professors. We had no contact with concepts that were far beyond just the simple curriculum. And of course, I came from little southern backward country background, but this is absolutely true. And I think it's true for most students. Yet you gentlemen and Fee make this level of thinking available, and it's incredible. I can also say that not just beyond the personal appearances, the fact that I have my kids read Cooperation and Coercion, but the fact that Fee provides these materials like Leonard Read's iPencil as a publication. There's kind of a freakish guy named Anthony Davies who wrote a book called Understanding Statistics that really slips under the radar, because I believe this should be a standard, not just for all of our high school students. I said to my students today, to whom I passed this book out, I believe that every politician should have to read this. Every journalist should have to read this, simply because it gives an extraordinarily powerful but simple understanding of how one interprets statistics.
We're always happy to come, Vann. But here's the thing. You said earlier that it's not the teacher and this kind of stuff. Well, Ant and I have been traveling to high schools probably for 6 or so years now. We have gone to rich schools and poor schools, private schools and public schools, magnet schools and charter schools, homeschoolers. And when we see great students, and it's always obvious when we're in front of a room filled with great students, we can tell within the first 30, 40 seconds of saying hello that this is what we've got. We look around, and always what we find is a stellar teacher.
Yep.
Every single time, without fail and without question. Rich schools, poor schools, overpaid, underpaid, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, the money doesn't matter.
It's not the money. And people are going to get all worked up about that, but I'm sorry, it's not the money. I'm not saying money's not important, of course it is, but it's not the determining factor here. And when we get to your school, your students are absolutely loaded for bear.
I'll tell you a story. The last time we were at your school, this would have been right before the lockdown. One of your students greeted us when we walked in the door and gave our lecture and whatnot. And she came up and was asking questions during the thing. And all through, from the time I met this woman, through the lecture, through the Q&A, through the personal conversation, I assumed she was one of the faculty.
Yeah.
I was blown away when you said, "Oh, you've met so-and-so. She's one of my star pupils." I said, "What do you mean pupil?"
It's astonishing when we get to your place. So, I'm going to push back on you hard. You need to take a lot of the credit here. But you said a bunch of other interesting things too. And one thing that we notice is the great teachers out there who have this sort of impact on their students either exist comfortably within a hierarchical system or ignore it entirely. It's always one or the other. The ones who rail against it never really get anywhere. I'm assuming you're the kind who lives within the system comfortably. Maybe you could just tell us how you do pull that off.
Actually, I exist in the system extraordinarily uncomfortably. I actually am embarrassed to work in my public school system. I'll probably be fired for this, but one of the problems with public school systems is I can't be fired for this. Right. And that's actually one of the great problems. And I can go into this ad nauseum. This would be an entirely separate episode. But what I have been blessed with is an immediate supervisional staff that is our so-called ITO, which is a team leader who, the woman who hired me, Angela Sugg, hired only quality. She just didn't care what the system wanted. She knew what quality was. And my current team leader, who is Don Walters, this gentleman, he will protect me from anything. Today's AP classes, we're very big tent. We put as many kids into them as possible because the school system gets higher ratings, not at the success of the kids, but the number of kids who are in the class. So the school systems have an incentive to put numbers in there. And there are also other incentives that deal with that evil word equity, which I don't even want to go down that road, but it's become very dangerous lately. So they put a lot of kids in these classes who simply are not ready for them at this stage. You guys know this because you deal with students who show up on your doorstep who don't know basic math or write a simple essay. this is the outcome, but it's the outcome of us. It's what we're doing, but largely it's what our system is doing to them. So we have these students in AP economics, they're not ready for it, but then we have these other students who are so far beyond. I will say that, yeah, this is a product of zip code. Our schools are driven by zip codes. We have a zip code that has a high average income. We're not a very wealthy area, but a lot of people work for federal government. So their average income is above the norm. But much, much more important is I live in a community where there have been lots of recent immigrants from South Asia, immigrants from East Asia, Korea, China, India, Pakistan. I could keep going. Here we have communities that adore education, who really respect teachers, who really support their students' success. And that's the magic formula. It's pretty easy. If you have a family, and a family is important, we can't all have the perfect family, but if a student has a family where you have usually two parents and usually are highly supportive of education, including, excuse me, James, I hate to insult you, but including above the priority of sports ball, right? and
James' bald head is turning red right now.
I'm with you there, though, Ant, because I live in a school that's probably a little too sports ball oriented.
If you two idiots had brains in your heads.
Beyond that, the fact that we have these families supporting these kids, we are not an elite school, but I believe it's because of our immigrant population that we have such support. It's a beautiful thing. And so those people who are anti-immigration or anti-American dream, you have no idea. Here are all these families who are giving their everything to be here for the things that are here. It's unbelievable. And you've been to my school. You've seen the faces there. When people are talking about diversity, that's what they should mean, because the diversity there is just beautiful.
It's cool, too, because I look out on the crowd and I see every human color I can imagine.
Totally.
Right.
And nobody in the crowd thinks anything of it.
Not a single thing. When we were kids, it would have been a topic.
Right.
But for these kids, it is a non-topic. They don't think of it. They've grown up in this world. They've seen it their whole life. They love their friends. They don't for 1 second think about whether my friend is X, Y, or Z. But they'll be honest enough to say Prime is a redheaded white guy. Well, yeah, because it's true. But they don't care. It doesn't mean anything to them. And the day we recognize that this kind of diversity is what drives so much of this, because back to my point, I am so blessed to have families that care. Ultimately, it comes down to that. But that also means that there are students who are driven. They just want to accomplish on their own, for pride's sake, for whatever it is. I have a very Big Ten econ program. I teach 128 kids a year. Many years we have 1 or 2 classes where I have to teach the other teachers how to teach econ, because we have too many kids trying to take econ, which is great for me. We have all of these bodies coming in, but we just have this cycle. And right now, as I said, I don't have to do anything. I actually step back, and with the older kids, I give them very challenging tests, but it's really down at the heart where the older kids are teaching the younger kids that the magic is happening. And ultimately, it comes down to recruiting the very best kids, period. And if they know that there's a chance to win a national championship, the best kids pour in. The kids most academically adept at handling economics come in. Those kids end up being incredible economics students. You've seen the colleges that these kids are going to. And when they show up at the University of Chicago or Columbia or Harvard or MIT or Stanford or wherever these kids have ended up, they're going to be at a 300 plus level the day they entered that school.
I want to jump on something you said because you described them as the best students. The natural pushback is to say, well, clearly, if you've got the smartest of the smartest students, this sort of thing is going to happen. Don't let me put words in your mouth, but from what I've observed from you, when you say best, you don't necessarily mean smartest, but most driven, most willing to come and sit down and work.
Yeah, that's absolutely it, particularly for the Econ Challenge. These kids have to be self-motivated because they do it all on their own.
James and I started off talking about how the magic sauce is not the money, it's the teachers. And you're bringing a second ingredient to the list, and that is the parents. That the parents raise children who are inquisitive, who are willing to work, who will keep at it, even in the face of adversity.
You know what, Ann? I can add a little thing to that because I've lived in so many places. And I can tell you a couple of things about my time in Utah. Teachers are not well compensated in Utah, not at all. That's seen, largely speaking, as a job for a wife of a husband who does something else. I offer no comment on that. I'm just saying that that's how it is. And yet, if you take a look at Utah, everybody there, and I mean everybody there, is literate. Mm-hmm. By the time they go to school, they can already read and write. Why? Because their parents teach them. It's an important thing in the culture. It doesn't hurt that the entire state is demographically pure, right? It's just one kind of person there, and they all go to the same things, and they all do the same things. But then there's this upside to it that they expect things. And Vann, I want to paint you into a corner for a minute because everything you've said has pointed to one single word that never escapes your lips. And it's a word that public school teachers are loath to use for any number of reasons, but that I, as a student of the ancient Greeks, see all the time. And that's excellence. You have the pursuit of excellence at your school. It's expected. There are standards, and the students can't wait to live up to them. They take that as a challenge, and they understand your standards as proof that you care about them. And I think that's exactly right. So why is it that we only find schools like yours 1 in 20 schools we visit?
Well, it's not due to our school system. Our school system is increasingly steering away from excellence and driving down standards. It's kind of sad. And so we're at a point where we can't do that. And even as I said, we have this big tent AP Econ program. Advanced placement typically means advanced placement. It typically means gifted kids. It means kids who are in 11th or 12th grade who are ready for a university course. A lot of my kids aren't. I'm faced with 130 kids a year, some of whom do not speak English, but they've been put into the class because there are no prerequisites. It's a 100% voluntary class. I've had kids who have not passed Algebra 2, but are in my university level economics class that I typically teach at a 200 level. And here's where I think economics education falls on its rear. Basic economics classes tend to try to teach students as though they are future graduate students in economics, introductory economics classes. So we shove all of this technical, mechanical stuff down their throats. But economics is at its most exciting, its most beautiful, its most eye-opening, its most transformational when it's taught at that basic level that you gentlemen, when you come to my school and you talk to kids about econ, you're trying to get to. Now, I came into this all as a convert. I didn't study econ as an undergrad, but when I got into my school system, there was no, and there still is, no economics requirement. Can you imagine this? Think of this. We have a system that teaches a full year of American government and no economics. So we're teaching kids government. And then the last 2 weeks, they slip in this little bit about econ. Shouldn't it be that at least the front half is economics before you put the government in?
But I think you hit the nail on the head that one of the major differences is we teach government the way you should teach government, which is this is what it is. There are stories, there's description, you get a gut feeling for what's going on. It's no charts and graphs and equations and any of that. But when it comes to economics, we do it the other way around. And so the students come in, they can draw demand and supply and do the equations, and they have no idea why they're doing what they're doing because they never got the intuition.
Totally agree. Most econ teachers are completely innocent of this, but this is what our program does. I focus the first 8 weeks or so on really the fundamentals. Now, I have the advantage, by the way, econ teachers in high school, we have the advantage of having students who have no prior knowledge. I'm not trying to train future graduate students. Instead, I teach supply and demand, prices, spontaneous order, the price system, and opportunity cost, of course, that incentives matter, that there are unintended consequences. All of these things, I think it's Thomas Sowell who said the most important question of economics is, and then what?
Right.
If you make a decision, then what's going to happen? It doesn't just apply to decisions by the federal government, but it applies to you every single day. And parents tell me this all the time. We're sitting at the dining table, and before they were talking about what they were doing on their video game. And now they come back and they tell me, there's a cost to that decision, Mom, and we really should think about that, right?
If you could change public education, how would you do it? What would you do?
If I could change it one way, I would get rid of teacher tenure. I would make a market for teacher salaries so that physics teachers and chemistry teachers and calculus teachers and even economics teachers were paid according to the demand for them. I don't want to demean anyone, but we live in a truly communist system as public school teachers. It is totally top down. All the decisions are made at the top and they all spill down to the bottom. We are paid exactly the same no matter what we do in my school system. And this has been particularly a painful spot during COVID, where certain teachers who have no role whatsoever, who are being paid a full salary, and you have other people who are being paid the equivalent salary. So right now, I'm in my 16th year of teaching. I have blah, 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 master's degrees. Actually, if you guys were in teaching, you would make exactly $1,600 a year more than I would because you have PhDs. That's not much of an incentive to get a PhD. Let's say a PE teacher, a second grade teacher. How can you compare a teacher there to a teacher who's teaching physics, calculus at a university level and pay them exactly the same? Right? They're not the same jobs. And clearly the supply of those teachers is much smaller. So how do you recruit those teachers? You pay them accordingly. It's that simple.
Vann, this may shock you, but we paid the professors, when I was at the American University of Iraq, we paid the professors the same amount regardless of discipline. And it was a pretty heavy paycheck for some of them and kind of light for others, right? And it was so easy to get English professors, because we were paying 3 times what they were going to make back in the States. Finance professors, on the other hand, it was almost impossible to get a competent one. How could you? Because they could make twice as much without going to a war zone.
Of course.
I mean, this is just basic stuff, right? I mean, people need to be paid according to their value.
So if you're saying, as they are saying in the public schools, that you want to enhance STEM education, and they actually throw econ, Aunt, you'd be happy. They often throw us into that mix, but they say they want to enhance STEM education. How are you going to attract qualified teachers unless you pay them accordingly? I'd like to see the end of collective bargaining, which is essentially the same thing. I don't want to be part of a union. I'm Prime. I have something to bring to the table, and I'm not afraid to bring it to the table. And I'm not afraid to say, I deserve a little bit more than person X because this is what I bring to your school. And again, I don't want to sound egotistical, but we're bringing national, international championships and that focus on this public school and this public school system, that PE teacher X is making more than I am because she has more years in, is not equitable. We spend more per student than any other large developed country in the world, and yet our outcomes are pitiful. And there's a reason for that. And I will lay the reason out right here because I'm not one. They are because of the teachers' unions, and they are because of the bureaucracy and government-run schools. This is another place. If I could change the schools, I would open everything up to school choice. I would give parents a complete choice on what they wanted to do for schools, not trap them into their zip code. Right now, we have people moving into 21042, and they know if they move in there, they're going to get a pretty decent public school, and they're going to do fine, but they can only do so by paying a large premium. But we are abutting Baltimore City, and those kids have no chance. They have no chance. I believe in school choice for a million reasons. One of the biggest is school competition, right? I want to see competition among schools, among teachers. I don't want to be protected from competition. I want to be open to it. I want to be the guy who benefits from it. I'm not afraid of competition, but so many in my field are. Public schools attract security seekers. And I'm generalizing here, but it's absolutely true.
Vann, thank you so much for coming. This was a really great conversation, and I suspect we're going to have a lot of nodding heads from the other teachers who listen to Words and Numbers. In a way, you stand in for all of them when you do this sort of thing, and we appreciate you, and we appreciate that you came on here. But that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes.
Email.
Join Words.
Send email. wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
You know, this pisses me off so much.
Say something nice about Vann and I'll forward it to him. Say something bad about James, I'll forward it to him too.
I get all this spam day in, day out from people trying to sell me all kinds of crap that come from the Words and Numbers email address that you set up like a fool. And now I have to dig out from underneath this pile of crap every morning when I should be just having a nice time drinking my coffee. Anyway, join the Words and Numbers Backstage Facebook group where the conversation continues and where Ant acts as an unmitigated fool there, just as he does here. And Ant, maybe, we'll see. Maybe I'll see you next week.
See you next week, James.
I'm going to get a new economist around here.